You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong, happy to be back with you once again for another week. Coming at you a day later. I had too many things on Monday, so you get me on Tuesday. Depending on when you're listening, maybe Wednesday, Thursday, I don't know. You know, you do you. So we're going to continue our scheduling preview, so we'll get into that. We'll also take a look at the Big 12 basketball matrix that was released last week, as well as an update on recruiting and official visits, and then we'll talk BYU and Colorado, which will be the next two teams on Utah's schedule. So we'll get into that. First, let me tell you about our partners, though. Every possibility begins with a spark, and a possibility can grow into something even better than expected. With a clear view of what matters most, your possibilities are endless. From its first flicker at the University of Utah, U First Credit Union has grown to meet its potential and ignites your possibilities. They've grown into Canyon View Credit Union. Same roots, new path. Welcome to Canyon View Credit Union. Check out the full details at canyonviewcu.com. All right, so last week, the Big 12 released its scheduling matrix. They don't have any dates per se for their teams. It's just more a look at who are the opponents that each team is going to face this year in conference play. The conference is moving from a 20-game conference schedule to an 18-game conference schedule. So we'll see, how the non-conference schedule shakes out and all that kind of stuff. But essentially, we got to learn about the three home-and-home series that Utah will have, as well as their home opponents and then their away opponents. So just jumping into it, for the men's basketball team, the home-and-home series are BYU, Arizona State, and Colorado. So those three teams, they're going to play two times. And then the home teams, the teams that are going to be coming to the Huntsman Center this year for Utah, is Arizona, Iowa State, TCU, Houston, UCF, and Oklahoma State. And then Utah will go on the road once to Cincinnati, West Virginia, Kansas, Kansas State, Texas Tech, and Baylor. That Kansas State stretch will be interesting, especially after Utah beat them last year. All of these games are going to be interesting. It's the Big 12. You can't say that they're not going to be interesting. But you do get some good games at home. You get Houston at home, which is still supposed to be good. Arizona's obviously always good. All of these teams in the Big 12 are pretty much good. So you get some good games that are coming into the Huntsman Center, and this will be Alex Jensen's first year, and being able to see how this new roster shapes out. They did add a freshman guard, Jacob Patrick from Germany. That puts their limit essentially at the end. So right now, assuming that everything works together and everything goes on, Utah will be at 14 of their 15 max players that they can add. In past, you may remember it was 13, so Utah's right there. One of the biggest knocks against Craig Smith was that he could never fill out his full scholarship limit. But already Alex Jensen has done that, despite having to basically retool an entire roster. So last week I posted an update on this, and you can go look at the full roster if you want to go do that on KSL.com. If not, the University of Utah clearly has that on their website, so you can do it there. I've tweeted about it, all those different things. So this roster is shaping up to be pretty good. A lot of potential. It fits more of the Big 12 model of a lot of energy, a lot of tempo, more, I wouldn't even call it small ball, but more guard play. And so, you're going to get a lot of that. And I think this home schedule is, I wouldn't call it favorable, but it's a good schedule for Utah. And if they can get some momentum going into Big 12 play, I think that works. We'll get to know non-conference schedule and all the rest of the full schedule later. But at least we have an idea of kind of where these, or who Utah will be playing this year. It's obvious that they're going to play BYU every year. I can't imagine a world where they don't. There could be a possibility, but I have to imagine BYU always remains as that home-and-home series. So you get that, and then two other opponents this year, Arizona State and Colorado. So two familiar opponents for Utah from their Pac-12 days, and so you get that. On the women's side, their home-and-home series are, once again, BYU, and then they get Arizona and Arizona State. Once again, two former Pac-12 opponents. essentially what this is doing is they're trying to maximize their potential with these home and home series so that teams aren't having to fly across the country multiple times, right? They're obviously going to do this with their different opponents that they're facing, but at the same time, for these home and home series, they want to try to keep them regionally as much as possible, at least this year. We'll see what the next few years bring, but right now, these teams are going to face teams in similar geography. So imagine that, living in a conference with similar geography. Anyways, so you do have those 3 home and home series for the women. They bring in Baylor, Cincinnati, Iowa State, TCU, Texas Tech, and West Virginia to the Huntsman Center. And then they will travel on the road to Colorado, Houston, Kansas, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, and UCF. So another good schedule that we're gonna learn a lot from this women's basketball team. They're gonna be a lot younger than they have been. Obviously, Utah has had a lot of veteran players. Gianna Neepkins clearly led the charge as the star of the team. She transfers out, and then you have a bunch of those veteran leaders graduating. So you do get Jenna Johnson back, not on the roster, but in a coaching role. She was able to get an opportunity that allows her to coach. It's the same opportunity that Miley O'Keefe got again this year for the Red Rocks, so she'll be back with the Red Rocks. But you do get a younger roster. This is Gavin Peterson's first full season as the head coach. You could argue last year was pretty much that. I mean, Lynn Roberts left something like 4 to 6 games in the season, but this is his full stamp. It's not quite fully his recruiting, but it is his roster, and he's built it that way. These women have, had many chances to be able to go to the transfer portal or whatever if they wanted to, and so this is his roster to be able to do with it. As a side note to that, Gavin Peterson is bringing in an official visit from 5-star 26 combo guard Brooklyn Hayward in September. She's a top 25 guard in the country, or I should say top 25 player in the country, and she's got a visit scheduled with Baylor in July, the end of July. So really good opportunity for Utah to be able to bring in another star player on an official visit. We'll see what happens there and if they can get her to commit to Utah. But the fact that you're able to get those types of players shows that Gavin still has some cachet, right? Like this isn't something that, even though as a new coach, in terms of new head coach, he's not having to scratch the bottom of the barrel. He's punching up and trying to get the best players that he possibly can. And Utah's track record the last few years of getting into the NCAA tournament, and yes, a lot of that is from Lynn Roberts. He was on staff, so you can't take away from Gavin. But a lot of that was from her kind of cachet and everything. This is now his opportunity to kind of showcase that. And the fact that you're getting an official visit from Brooklyn Hayward shows that, there's still some opportunities there, and really fascinated to see how those rosters come together. So that's the basketball side. There's not much there other than just the scheduling. So you've got those. We'll look forward to that and see how this goes with basketball. Hopefully there's more competition up on the Hill this year. As Alex Jensen gets there, Gavin Peterson gets his roster together and everything that way. Now, let's move to the official visits and recruiting. Last week was a bit of a slower week in terms of official visits. There were 3 players that came through on June 10th. Most notably was 4-star wide receiver Chase Campbell. He was there, as well as a couple defensive players on the line, both 3-star players. And so, you didn't have much there. They had a few scheduled for this last weekend. It would be June 13th that they had a few scheduled, but a lot of those players had already committed to another school and then canceled their visit. So Utah had much more of a quiet weekend than was expected. And then, you've got coming into the next week, June 20th, which is essentially the quote-unquote last day for official visits during the summer period before you get into the, school and all that kind of stuff. This is the time period where you're going to start seeing kind of a lot of these athletes commit to programs if they haven't already, because they've now taken all of their official visits and they're going to see how things go. And so scheduling a player in this last period is a good sign in the sense that that you get them on their last date, but it's it's not a guarantee by any means that players are going to commit. So as part of that, Utah yesterday, and well, it wasn't Utah didn't announce this, but it was announced yesterday that Utah will be bringing in 5-star offensive tackle Felix Ojo. He's the number 2 rated player in Texas. Incredibly highly rated player. He's a heavy lean for Texas. It makes sense, to be able to have a hometown kid come to Texas, a 5-star kid, which is usually the types of players that they get. But Felix canceled his Oklahoma visit that he had scheduled for this week and instead put Utah on there. Now this is a tall task, right? It's not an easy thing to be able to bring in a 5-star player to Utah, let alone bring them in, but then to get them to commit. We've seen a few more over the years than in recent past, right? In terms of players being able to come to Utah. But there's a real reason why a 5-star offensive tackle would consider Utah, and that's what we've talked about in the last few episodes with Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu potentially moving on next year to the NFL. And if you can get both of them as a first round or even first and second round, that bodes well not only for kind of your recruiting cachet in terms of what you can do and sell to these recruits, but it now opens up 2 spots for people that are projected to probably be starters from day one in there. As we've seen, Jim Harding isn't afraid to start freshmen if they're ready, and these 2 freshmen were ready, and so you'll see maybe a little bit more attention that way if the money's right and if the fit is right and all that kind of stuff. So Utah's going to have to sell out for Felix Ojo, but the fact that you're getting in an official visit to Utah on his last official visit bodes well. But like I said, Texas is going to be the heavy favorite here, but you got to shoot your shot sometimes. So you got that. Now, as part of some commits, since last time we talked, Utah had 2 commits on the offensive side of the ball. So you get 3-star quarterback Michael Johnson from Georgia, and then you get a 3-star running back LaMarcus Bell from Oregon. He's actually the number 2 rated player in Oregon. Utah's class hasn't been big, but they've been able to bring in a lot of top guys from different states to be able to kind of consider Utah. Now, not all of them are going to go Utah's way, but at the same time, you're bringing in a lot of guys that are considering Utah, that are highly ranked inside their state. And so, that bodes well for the Utes. Both of these players were, had a lot of good offers. Michael Johnson, the QB, probably still has, I wouldn't call him under-recruited. I think there's still more for him to prove for other people to want to consider him. But Utah brought him in early. He was arguably one of the best offers that Utah had, and so it was an easy sell, especially after that official visit. Both of these players, Michael Johnson and LaMarcus Bell, have been heavily recruiting other players to come to Utah, so far so good. We've seen in past that doesn't always mean everything, but the fact that you have guys that are committed and are actively trying to commit other people to the program is a good sign just for, the program to be able to have other guys do that. And then yesterday, so Monday, Utah picked up the commitment from 3-star safety Carter Stewart. He's from Texas. Right now he has a lower rating, but he has a ton of great P4 offers or good P4 offers. Arizona State, Baylor, Maryland, Michigan State, Oklahoma are just a few. I would assume those numbers or his rating goes up a little bit, but we'll see. These senior years are always interesting to see how athletes perform. Some of these guys are going to take a dip in their ratings, and some are going to absolutely shoot up the board after doing, different summer camps / seeing them in their senior year, right? That's just the nature of it. So right now, Utah is set at 6 recruits for the 2026 class. As we've mentioned before, this hasn't been the most the most noise around this class in terms of what Utah's able to do. But I think part of that comes with, if Utah can win on the field, you're going to start picking up some of these guys. They're building relationships right now, whether that's through official visits or just other contact. They're trying to build those relationships and make sure that the teams are still aware, or players are still aware of them, right? And so you may not see a guy commit early in the summer, but as the season goes on, assuming that Utah can have a successful season, maybe you can start chipping away at some of those recruits as you get into that early signing period and stuff like that. So that's where it stands now. So let's jump into the scheduling preview. You were halfway through the season, essentially. Utah, I would say, is probably about 4-2. That's probably the bettor's safe pick. They could be 3-3. Anything below 4-2, though, I would say is probably a disappointment based on kind of what was being talked about as this team could be. I don't want to overhype this team by any means, and so I don't want to think that they should be 6-0 at this point. They're not, right? Like, if they are 6-0, great. Obviously, Utah's in for a special season, and things are going well for them. But I think the most realistic look is 4-2 at this point in the year. You've played Texas Tech, you've played Arizona State. Those two would be probably your most likely of losses. But that's not to say you couldn't lose to UCLA or lose to some other team down the stretch. But to me, that's probably the most realistic look. So you're coming now into this rivalry stretch, right? Everybody calls the BYU Colorado the rivalry stretch, right? You've got BYU, which is the natural rival that's been there. It's this heated rival, arguably the best rivalry in the Big 12, and people are starting to realize that, just especially with the fireworks that happened last year. But then you get Colorado, which, hasn't really been much of a rivalry, but everybody wants to pair them since they're Pac-12 days, since the geography and being close. So we'll play along with that, and we'll call this the rivalry stretch of Utah's schedule. Beginning this week for BYU is the beginning where Utah doesn't leave the state of Utah. So it's a 6-week that was the last week. They're in the middle of that, right? Sorry. They're in the middle of their 6-week stretch where they don't leave the state of Utah. And so, it'll be a good opportunity in the sense that they don't have to travel so many different places and then have to play these two teams. So with BYU, this game is being played on October 18th at LaVell Edwards Stadium. This is going to be a hopping situation, and that place is going to be packed as the Cougars try to go for another win. They have Arizona the week before. They're on the road to Arizona the week before. So depending on who Arizona is this year, maybe that's a challenging game for the Cougars. We honestly don't even know much about what this Cougars team could be based on some things that we'll get into in just a second. But you've got Arizona the week before. BYU has the odd schedule this year in the sense that they have a bye in week 3. And so they're going to have this bit of a period where they get their early break. I would argue it's a little too early. If it was me, I wouldn't want a week 3 bye. So they get a little bit of an early break, and then they have this long stretch before they get their second bye. So it could be challenging. Maybe that early bye is a good reset on whatever needs to happen, good or bad, right? I'm not saying that they're going to lose any of those 2 first games. I actually think BYU's front part of the schedule is pretty easy. That if they're not 6-0 going into this game, I would be surprised. But that also depends on those factors that I said. So this will be an interesting lead up to that. Last year, obviously, BYU finished with an 11-2 record, 8-2 in Big 12 play. Was picked as one of the worst teams in the conference, and then surprised everybody and really rolled off a bunch of wins. That Kansas State game obviously really propelled them to kind of the forefront of people's minds, and then they just kept building from there, and unfortunately lost a few games down the stretch that kept them out of the Big 12 title game. They obviously felt like they should be there. Their team was playing great ball together, and everything was going well. Especially on the defensive side of the ball, where Jay Hill completely changed the momentum and the trajectory of that program. Offense was fine. It was more middling of the country, but it was good enough to be able to do what they needed to, mixing that with the defense that was pretty stout and dominant. So you had a pretty good team that it did kind of wane a bit down the stretch of the season before picking up, and then obviously kind of show out against Colorado in the bowl game. So, interesting situation there. BYU is on a 2-game win streak over Utah, and so you're going to see, a lot of effort to try to get that third. Last year's game was obviously really close, came down to a field goal at the last second to beat Utah on their home turf. A lot of theatrics went into that game. I'm not going to get into that. That's not really what I care about, but there was a lot there, obviously. I would assume you're going to get a lot of that as well. Who knows? You can never predict these games. Their preseason win projection is 7.5. It's the exact same as Utah's. I think there's just a lot of unknowns, even though they're, were a proven commodity last year. And that win projection came before the Jake Retzlaff news. So, that's still where they were putting them. I think there's just a lot of teams that are going to be, competing for that. And so it's going to be a real challenge for anybody to kind of understand who is going to get that win. So their SP plus strength of schedule is 64th. So like I said, it's pretty soft. They should be able to have a pretty easy time to be able to get to 6-0 coming into that part of the stretch. There are some few hang-up games and then some few things. A road game to East Carolina, that sounds like it should be an easy win, but that doesn't always turn out that way. That week before Utah, that Arizona game, depending on how that goes, that could be a tough one on the road. Especially if you're looking ahead to Utah. I mean, you never know the mentality of these teams where, you're not supposed to look ahead, but the fact that you get Utah the week after, I mean, that's always going to be a thing, right? Utah's going to have the same problems that they're going to have to address that before coming into this game, and it's a road game. So really interesting. It's going to be a tough situation for both these teams, but that's what makes it great. So looking at some of the key stats, like I said, the offense was pretty average, I would say, based on rankings. They ranked 60th in passing, 68th in rushing, 59th in total offense. It was a good team on offense. It just wasn't great, right? Especially compared to their defense. The defense was the star. Even then, though, the offense was a big improvement from the year prior. And so you saw some improvement, and I think there was a lot more positivity around that offense simply because, one, they played together. There was a lot of consistency and rhythm, and it was an improvement from last year, right? A pretty significant improvement. I mean, you look at rushing alone, they were 120th in the country the year before and finished 68th. They were 121st in total offense the year before and finished 59th. So it was a marked, improvement, obviously much better than that previous year. And so it's easy to look at that and be really excited. Defensively, though, was a massive swing. You went from a defense, and I'm going to read all of these because this is, I think it's really important. They finished 18th in scoring defense last year. They were 99th the year before. 33rd in run defense, 112th the year before. 20th in pass defense, 92nd the year prior. And then 13th in total defense, where they were 109th a year prior. Now, that year prior was Jay Hill's first season, but he wasn't really able to kind of scheme and get these guys in immediately, right? It takes time for these things to develop. The next year, when his entire philosophy was kind of felt through the program, you saw that change. You had guys buying in. You also had some veteran leaders like Tyler Batty that comes in there. You had a lot of these players that were really committed to this defense. And when things were going well, it added to that, right? Momentum is a big thing, and BYU absolutely capitalized on that last year. That was a great thing for them, and you now look at this, and that defense is going to be one that you have to pay attention to, especially as it ranks compared to any of the programs in the Big 12. Defense has still been decent. Like Iowa State, for example, they put a lot of effort in their secondary, right? There's been a lot of effort in defenses there. But BYU is going to be near the top these next few years, I would assume, just because Jay Hill is there, and he's done a tremendous job of being able to get that defense in a great spot. So regardless of what happens on the field, you know that BYU now is going to field a good defense. The players may change, and maybe they take dips here and there, or maybe they take rises here and there, but Jay Hill is going to be the one consistent that I think really helps this BYU squad move forward, especially if there are some issues on offense, or the offense isn't clicking as well as it needs to. But with that said, we saw last year with Utah specifically, a great defense doesn't necessarily propel you to wins, right? So you do have to pair these together. It needs to work, and I think what they had last year was a perfect combination of that, where the offense could do what they needed to do and the defense was going to take care of everything else, right? And so it's a very Kyle Whittingham style model. These two programs, obviously, with the interchange between the coaching staffs and everything, they very much so are a splitting image of each other. So as much as these two hate each other, they're the same program in a lot of respects. They're not, but they are, if that makes sense. So not anything to worry about with coaching changes. Everything stays consistent there. You do get your key pieces in the same position, and so that works. Now, looking at the transfer portal and recruiting, they lost 28 players and only brought in 13. Every year BYU's been, at least the last few years, I would say, they've been a little bit more quiet in the transfer portal. They haven't pushed really hard to be able to get in there in football. But that's not to say that they're not bringing in quality guys or guys that are upgrades, right? Just because you lose that many players doesn't mean that all of them were starting caliber players or in there. Now, with that said, they did lose some good players. Keelan Marion, one of their leading receivers, their third leading receiver, went to Miami. Cody Epps, another wide receiver, went to Western Kentucky. You can replace Cody Epps a little bit more than you can Keelan Marion, but both, had their roles and they had different things. Hinkley Ropati, running back, he was their third leading rusher. He still hasn't picked up a team. At least I haven't seen anything there, mostly because of injuries, if I'm not mistaken. And then Harrison Taggart, one of their better linebackers. He, played in the starting lineup, but also was kind of featured in kind of more of a reserved role. Went to California. Even then, though, he was their fifth best player on defense, and so. You're losing some opportunities there. You lose a bunch of other players like Crew Wakely, a safety. He went to Purdue, one of your best safeties. You have some players that left that were losses. And so the biggest losses, I would say, came on the defensive line. You lose 4. You lose 3 wide receivers, running backs, tight end. Like you lose some players that can be impact, and it's tough to always make that up. But they do well to bring in some needs. The biggest names that they brought in, Bear Bachmeier, QB from Stanford, still a freshman, but a big name that they are hoping will do well for them. They bring in his brother Tiger Bachmeier, who's a wide receiver. Hasn't had a ton of production, but package deal, and you get them in. They also bring in Carson Ryan. You may remember that name at Utah, tight end. At Utah last year, he only had 113 yards and 1 touchdown. But little of that was his fault. Honestly, I'm really curious to see how Carson does in this offense because I think he could have a lot more potential at BYU based on kind of how things went last year. I think he was wasted at Utah, and unfortunately, he wasn't able to show out the way that I think a lot of people expected him to. So I'm still pretty high on Carson. I think he could do some good things. BYU hasn't necessarily featured tight ends a ton. And so curious to see how he factors in there, but I still think he's got a ton of potential that is untapped, and I think he'll be pretty solid. They bring in also another Utah transfer in Keanu Tenavasa, defensive lineman. Obviously, there was a whole saga about that. I'm not going to get into that. You can have your own opinions about that. All I'll say is if you really are that frustrated by it, go beat him, right? Like, that's all you're saying. You do also bring in Justin Kirkland, another defensive lineman from Oklahoma State. He was the Cowboys' 4th best player on defense. Both of these players, Keanu Tenavasa and Justin Kirkland, they don't necessarily rank that high on PFF in terms of their overall grades, but they can be solid players. And depending on how Jay Hill's able to use them, I think they have potential and could be really good for BYU, especially as they're going to be relied upon to kind of be the mainstays on that line. So you then get on the opposite side of that line, Andrew Gentry, an offensive lineman transfer from Michigan. He was their 4th best player on offense, and I think he's got a lot of potential there to really solidify an offensive line that has lost a few players. I think, the offensive line only returns 1 starter. And so if you can get that in there, he's a great pass blocker. That's going to help whomever starts at quarterback there. That's going to be good there. So, you bring in some good players that fit in. I think they've done well to fit some needs. There are still some questions that, are going to be asked, but I think this is a team that, you've got to be able to move forward with what you've got, but you did lose some key pieces that are going to be tough to replace. Now, looking at kind of the players to watch, we'll say number one is going to be Jake Retzlaff. And you're going to watch him for multiple reasons. Obviously, there was a recent report about him. There was a civil lawsuit related to a sexual assault case that happened a couple years ago. This is a situation that's really going to be fascinating to watch. And I'm not going to get into the legalities of it or anything like this. At the end of the day, it's a legal issue, and that matters more than football, right? And you don't want to rush something there, but at the same time, it can cause a distraction if things aren't handled appropriately, right? And so this is going to be a really fascinating situation to see what BYU does. If any of this that has been alleged is true, which I tend to believe these victims when they put it out there, because they have so much more to lose than a lot of these other people, and they have to be re-victimized every single time that they come out there in the news, and then listen to a bunch of people re-victimize them again over social media. Not saying these things can't be inaccurate or wrong, but I generally tend to believe it. I've read a bunch of books on this kind of stuff. Like I'm a big proponent that you believe the victim, right? That's not to say that these things can't come out as wrong. That's why we let the courts handle it. We see what happens. I think that's where BYU is a little bit. I know a lot of people want to rush and say, you need to get him out of the program. You need to do this, honor code, whatever. This is a BYU matter, right? And to the extent, it's not even a BYU matter until that legal matter is finished. Now, with that said, assuming that this legal matter isn't solved by the beginning of the season, that puts BYU in a very uncomfortable position. Do you keep Jake Retzlaff out there on the field knowing that this is hanging over your head, or do you suspend him? There's a lot of different situations here that really is just an unknown. And so it's going to be really tough to know what this BYU squad will be, knowing that it's, June 17th today, and, fall camp essentially starts in a little over a month and a half or so, and we don't know who is going to be taking those snaps. That is a tough spot. If Jake Retzlaff is, acquitted or cleared or whatever you want to say in this situation, and he is their returning quarterback, assuming that there's no extra penalties from BYU based on honor code or whatever that may be, you know what you're going to get with Jake Retzlaff. And I think if he is their quarterback, you have a lot more consistency in terms of the football standards, right? You know what you're going to get, and you understand what type of a player he can be. If not, BYU is going to either go with Bear Bachmeier, the QB from Stanford, who's a freshman, who I would say probably has a higher upside than McKay Hillstead. Also, the other quarterback, you saw him at Utah State, freshman. He's from Utah. You saw him light it up at the high school level. These two quarterbacks are going to be the ones that they most likely turn to. Hillstead obviously has the most Division I experience playing at Utah State, where he threw for 1,000 yards, but he threw 8 interceptions and he only completed 59.8 or 59.5% of his passes. That's actually higher than what Jake Retzlaff did last year. And so, maybe it's a similar situation that you would be okay with, right? I would say you probably have a better situation with Hillstead simply because he understands the offense now after being with the program for a year. He's got Division I experience, but do you go with the higher upside guy with Bear Bachmeier, who is going to be a freshman, and as we've seen, true freshmen really struggle to be able to acclimate early. Even if they're successful, they may not be able to do everything at the speed that you want them to. This is going to be a really tough situation for BYU. The easy thing for me is if Jake Retzlaff doesn't play, you put in Hillstead to start. You got it. You've got it, settled, and you at least have some consistency. A guy that understands the offense, a guy that has played at Utah State. You at least have something there. We'll see. Beyond that, as I mentioned, the offensive line returns one starter. You do get the 2 players from the portal. It's always fascinating to see how an offensive line gels. When you're changing that many new players, it's tough, right? And every program goes through that. This doesn't mean even the programs, let's say like a Texas or somewhere else that has these great players that come in, it still takes time to gel, and it takes time for these guys to work together. So we'll see by week, this week that Utah's playing BYU, you're going to have a good idea of what this offensive line can do. So there's not going to be any questions there. LJ Martin, a dynamic running back, comes back. He led the team in rushing last year at 718 yards, 7 touchdowns, averages 5.24 yards per carry. Really, really dynamic back that I think is going to potentially have an even better year this next year. I think if they can scheme it well for him, the offensive line does well for him, and I think he can do well. But the two have to go hand in hand. If that offensive line isn't doing well, if the quarterback isn't doing well, there's a real potential where Martin's numbers could drop, or he's relied on more. It's tough to know. So on the receiving core, you lose Darius Lassiter and Keelan Marion, as I mentioned with him, 2 of your top leading receivers, but you do bring in Chase Roberts again for another season. He's the team leading receiver at 854 yards and 4 touchdowns. Dynamic player. Honestly, such a talented player that you have to scheme for. You have to be ready for, because he will beat you and does a really good job. You also bring back JoJo Phillips, wide receiver, 4th leading receiver last year. I mentioned Carson Ryan, potential opportunities there. And then we'll see if Tiger Bachmeier factors into that, or some of the other players that have been depth pieces for BYU factor in there. On the defensive side, you have 2 returning linebackers that are going to be the star of the defense. You've got Isaiah Glasker Jr. He's he was their best linebacker, 3rd best on defense. He split time in the box and on the line. He can do a lot of different things. A huge disruptor in the middle of the field, and in the guy that you just don't want to see, right? Played a lot of snaps, had 3 pass breakups, 2 interceptions. Really just a talented athlete that is going to do whatever he can to disrupt teams. You then also have Jack Kelly, who his PFF numbers are actually pretty low, but his impact on, I wouldn't say low, but they're 62.2, not as high as you would want it to be as a linebacker, but his impact on the team was absolutely felt. He mostly stayed in the box, had a ton of time as a linebacker, had 1 pass breakup, 1 interception that was returned for an interception. These 2 working together in tandem are going to be a great force for BYU's defense. Now, around them, there's a lot more questions. Right up in that defensive line, as I mentioned, there's going to be some questions because you're bringing in new guys. Yes, 2 of those guys on the defensive line specifically were starters at their previous schools, but it depends on how they transition at BYU, right? You always see that. The odds are that they'll do well, but we'll see. And I think Jay Hill will get the most out of these guys, so I have to imagine that they're going to be good, but it's still questions that you have to ask. And then behind them is Evan Johnson, their 2nd best defender as a corner. He had 1 pass breakup, 1 interception. Had a low NFL passer rating of 46.5, so he did really well to be able to limit passes to the receivers that he was guarding. And there's a lot of potential there. There's some players and positions that need to be filled out. Obviously opposite him, you've got safeties. You've got more of the defensive line. Who's going to be the disruptors there. But this is a team that, even though they lose, a significant amount of pieces on the defensive side, you lose Tyler Batty, who left the NFL. Those types of things are tough to replace. But I think Jay Hill has a good system in place that could be good. Now, are they going to be the same levels as they were last year? Maybe not. I don't know. That's tough to know. But I wouldn't doubt it in terms of kind of who this defense could be, right? Jay Hill is going to do enough. And I'm not here to kind of just praise Jay Hill for all of this, but I think he's just been a phenomenal asset to BYU, that there's a reason why that they had him at a high contract rate. There's a reason why, that he's such a beloved figure on that program. And quite honestly, in my view, if Kalani Sitake were to ever leave or get fired, I don't think he'd get fired, but if he ever were to leave, to me, Jay Hill would be the next great replacement that would work. It would make a lot of sense, right? He is the Morgan Scalley to Kyle Whittingham, and I think you've got a lot built in there that I think he's a great brand ambassador for the program, and he's just done a really good job of being able to make sure that this defense is going to be good. So regardless of what happens on the offense, I think the defense is going to be fine. Could they take a step back? Yes. It's hard to know, though. The offense, as I said, Jake Retzlaff future is really going to be the biggest I wouldn't even call it a distraction. It is a distraction, but it's going to be the biggest card that has to be figured out before you understand what this BYU team is going to be. Yes, there's a defensive line retool, but I think Jay Hill will get there and help. But then there's also the other factor that's similar to Arizona State that we talked about, that now that BYU has tasted success, and they've done it, and they have that proven history from last year, you have to stay on top, right? And every team that gets to that level, you have to find some way. And if you can do that, that's great, right? It clearly shows that the work that went into it wasn't just like a one-year thing. I think BYU's schedule lays up well for them to be able to continue to show that, assuming that all these pieces work together in the beginning of the season, assuming that all this comes together. But I think there's, you're getting yourself up to another game between these two programs that is going to be another fireworks type emotion, right? Utah, we still have a lot of questions that we have to learn about that program. We have to still see if similarly all these players that they've brought in through the transfer portal from the offensive side of the ball are going to gel. Yeah, you probably believe in the defense, and similar to BYU, that's going to be pretty solid, but what's that offense going to be? And if either one of these programs are in a world of hurt, that really factors into this game. But even then, last year, BYU was far and away the better team than Utah, and that game was still close, and Utah, had a chance to win it. So it's hard to know. These games are fun. It means something in the rivalry, and so we'll see what happens. So that is BYU. Then a week later, Utah returns to Rice-Eccles Stadium, where you bring on Colorado. Now, if you remember that Colorado game last year, this was just a nightmare, right? Like, it was close-ish through the first half, and then really that second half is just where everything just kind of unleashed. Isaac Wilson wasn't feeling well. He was really sick that game. It wasn't going well for him, and he tried to be a little bit more opportunistic later in the game, which led to even more turnovers. By then, though, in that season, Utah already had the hangover from BYU. There was already everything that had gone on in that season, that it was just one of those games that you kind of had to play, right? You had to go out, you had to do whatever, and just finish it. Colorado obviously had Shadir Sanders. They had Travis Hunter. These are two dynamic players that they were going to be enough. And so it was just this nightmare, and Colorado comes up winning 49-24 in Boulder. Honestly, a rare win for Colorado against Utah. In the last 10, Utah's 8-2, and before that, it was 8-1, right? In terms of that stat. So Utah owns the all-time record right now at 35-33. So these two teams, in the past, Colorado won a lot more, but ever since joining the Pac-12, Utah absolutely dominated Colorado, except for the year that they could have gone to the Pac-12 championship, but we get it. Colorado's record last year was 9-4, 7-3 in Big 12 play, was really in contention for a Big 12 title, but just kind of ran out of steam. Clearly a better program than the year before, but still not to the level that they had hoped. They hoped to have a little bit more, and then obviously lose to BYU in the bowl game that was expected to be pretty dynamic, and BYU just absolutely worked them. So this Colorado team will come to Salt Lake City with a bye the week before. So they do get an extra week of rest. This is the one opponent that Utah will face this year that gets a bye the week before. The 3 games before that, they're going to have BYU at home, then they go on the road to TCU, and then they have Iowa State at home. So tough teams that are going to be a challenge for Colorado, but you do get that bye week that helps. This late in the season, we'll 100% know what this team is all about. And, there's some questions going into them as well, but we're going to at least have a good understanding of who they are. They could be better than last year. I would say they're probably not, but they could. But I would assume they're going to be in the middle of the conference and kind of be one of those teams that just kind of is a disruptor. We'll see what kind of pieces that they have that can kind of make that work, but don't discount Colorado by any means just because you don't have Shadir Sanders or Travis Hunter lining up, with the opposite jersey. Their strength of schedule is ranked as 49th according to SP+. Pretty middle of the road. Good schedule, nothing too hard, nothing too easy, just kind of middle of the road. Last year, you clearly saw a year-over-year improvement from this team, even at the offensive line. But with that said, the run game was awful, like literally last place in the country awful. It wasn't great. It was the worst in the last 5 years, but it was also still a 2-year trend of similar production. So Not a great situation for Colorado. They finished well in scoring offense, a big jump from the year before, and then finished 6th in passing offense. I mean, this was a team that was built essentially just to pass the ball. But with that said, they were 126th in sacks allowed. They allowed 43, which was an improvement from the year before, but still 43 sacks. It's not great. Defense did improve, but they finished 42nd in scoring defense, 40th in passing defense, and 12th in opponent red zone conversion. So, I mean, it was definitely improved enough to be able to make a difference. There was just, not everything clicked all at the right time. And, I'm curious to see the impact that Travis Hunter, yes, he's one player, but what he was able to do on both sides of the ball absolutely is going to be felt. Shadir Sanders, yes, he took a lot of sacks, and his offensive line, allowed way too much pressures in there that he was scrambling all the time. He still threw for a ton of yards and still got that offense moving. So, really curious to see what this team can do. Now, looking at the transfer portal and kind of what they went through, they lost 33 players and brought in 33 players. So it was pretty much a wash. This year wasn't as big in terms of all the big names coming to Colorado, and everybody was going to Coach Prime. Like, you're starting to see a little bit more of that shine wear off. That's not to say that Coach Prime isn't bringing in good players or that players aren't attracted to his program, but I think you're not getting that same cachet that he had when he first started, where everybody wanted to come, everybody was throwing themselves at Colorado, that kind of stuff. This is much more of what would you call it? Like a normal transfer portal period. It's not normal in the sense that you're replacing 33 players, but well, maybe that is the new normal. But it's not as crazy as, let's say, Texas Tech, which brought in a bunch of star players. I would say Texas Tech had far better talent coming in through the transfer portal than what Coach Prime was able to do, but still impactful players. Now, with that said, Colorado did lose their starting centers, their backups, and their starter. They also lose Isaiah Augustov, running back, who went to South Carolina. He was their leading rusher, but there wasn't really much production. So I don't know if you're losing anything big or anything. You also lose some other offensive linemen, but like I said, that offensive lineman, even though it was improved, wasn't really something that you're going to be too worried about. Obviously, consistency matters, as I've mentioned, but I don't know. I think Colorado actually improved. So on the defensive side, they do lose some defensive ends that had a lot of snaps at Colorado. You lose some secondary players. Overall, though, you're not losing a ton of players that had a huge impact on the program. That's not to say that they weren't factored into that, but they weren't these big names that you have to replace, like a Shadir Sanders or a Travis Hunter, right? Like, those are the two names that you lost because of graduation or going to the NFL, than going through the portal. Now, from the portal, they were able to bring in Caden Salter, quarterback from Liberty, really talented player that a lot of people are high on, but at the same time, there's been reports out there that he hasn't been able to be as accurate as they want, and so we'll see kind of what happens there. They bring in a lot of offensive linemen, a lot of defensive linemen, bring in 2 wide receivers that are expected to be starters, Joseph Williams and Hakeem Williams. Joseph Williams comes from Tulsa, and Hakeem Williams comes from Florida State. So you've got a rebuilt offensive line that is going to be pretty solid. You've got a rebuilt defensive line that should be pretty solid, just based on all of these guys having experience at their prior schools. And then you fill out a secondary with some other guys that were pretty solid as well. So, some good pieces. Like I said, I wouldn't say that this is like earth-shattering, but it's definitely upgrades from what they've had. I think especially on the offensive line, this is a great opportunity for them, knowing that they have to replace 4 new starters essentially, and a majority of them have all been starters or at least have had good snaps at their prior school, that they should be pretty solid. The top one there is going to be Xavier Hill. He comes from Memphis. He's actually he's arguably the best one out there. I wouldn't even say arguably. It's probably the best one out there easily. He comes in with an 83.2 grade at in PFF from Memphis. He had a pass blocking grade of 86.8 and a run blocking grade of 80.4. So he's a pretty solid player. Can he do that at Colorado? I'd assume he'd be able to. But he's going to absolutely be the star of that offensive line that is going to bring in other guys that have starter reps or experience there. Now at the QB position, they bring in freshman Julian Lewis, a 4-star QB that is expected to get a ton of praise and love for kind of who he was as a high school kid. He's going to be battling it out with Caden Salter, like I said, who threw for 1,800 yards, 15 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, but it's still undecided, right? Once again, do you go with a freshman quarterback or do you go with somebody with a little bit more experience that doesn't have the greatest of accuracy numbers, but at least he understands how it's played? Similar to BYU, if Jake Retzloff can't go, you've got now 2 quarterbacks that you really are trying to figure out. I would argue Julian Lewis probably has the higher upside just based on kind of who he is expected to be, but that's not to say that he will be that. It's going to be a really interesting situation to see how Deion Sanders moves this forward. He's always been able to rely on Shadir to be able to do what he needs to. Now you have to rely on somebody else, and there's a lot of questions around that position. If the offensive line can do what it needs to and make improvements from even last year, you've got at least a much better opportunity ahead of you, but there's a lot of questions with this QB position. So Caden Salter, you can throw him in there initially, assuming that, he continues to make some progress. You at least have a guy that has had some experience and can get out there and understand what you need to do, but both are coming to the program fresh. It's going to be an interesting situation there. In the backfield, you have Micah Welch as your running back. He comes back as a backup from last year. He finished with 186 yards and 4 touchdowns. Has potential, but based on how little Colorado ran the ball last year, it's really hard to kind of know what his impact can be. I would assume if the QB play isn't as great, they lean a little bit more into the run game just to kind of help there, but it's hard to know there. And then they bring in a transfer into the Kalen Taylor from Incarnate Word, coming in from the FCS ranks to be able to add some consistency there. This is a good 1-2 punch, but based on how little Colorado has run the ball, it's hard to know what this is going to be. Now, as wide receiver, Colorado does lose, some of its star players. Obviously, Travis Hunter being one of them. You have 2 guys that are coming back in Draylon Miller and Amarian Miller, who are pretty solid as more underclassmen. They combined for 4 touchdowns and about 500 yards together. Two players that can have their impact and do what they need to. And then, as I mentioned, you get Joseph Williams and Hakeem Williams that are going to be able to be factored in there. Joseph Williams, especially at Tulsa, he was their team's second leading receiver with 588 yards and 5 touchdowns. I mean, his average catch is at 19.6 yards, and so, you're going to go deep with him a lot. But still a relatively unproven wide receiver corps, but you do have some talent coming in, and as long as the QB position works well, you could be okay. Defensively, they return 2 starters at defensive end, so you're pretty solid there. Defensive line, you're adding 2 new pieces in Jaheim Otis from Alabama and then Tavion Coleman from Texas State. He was one of the best on the defense at Texas State and has a really great upside. So the defensive line, in theory, should be able to be good. But then behind them at linebacker, you have transfer guys in Martavius French from UTSA and Reggie Hughes from Jacksonville State, all of which have good upside, but they haven't necessarily backed that up on the field to the level that you would expect to be kind of the stars of the defense, right? And so as much as this defense can return and improve, and I think they still have a great scheme and everything in place, it's going to be a tall challenge to be able to have a lot of this turnover, knowing that you're bringing in a lot of guys that have to hit, right? And they have to understand the scheme, and they have to understand it early, and it's not going to be an easy situation. So, for Colorado, the biggest questions are what's life like after Shadir Sanders and Travis Hunter? Obviously, they're not the only players, right? Like, we get that. but they were two impact players that helped them win games. And that matters, right? You also lose a lot of players that that can be impactful, but like I think you upgrade. So I think there's potential there, especially on the offensive line, where this could be a much better offensive line. But then on top of that, you have a quarterback play that's going to be a mixed review, right? We don't really know on who that's going to be. Can they be accurate? Can they get the schemes that they need to? Can they do what they want to do? Can Colorado have an improved run game? What's the turnover on defense look like? How does that help? There's a lot of questions for this program going forward. This is the year where you're really going to see Deion Sanders' coaching chops tested, right? It's easy to say that, you can have a 1 year drop and like this is going to be an indictment on him. I don't think it's that far, right? Like I think it's tough to go from having a team that can compete at a high level to then, or a higher level, to then losing all of that and then having to rebuild. So, I don't know that we judge him necessarily on this year, barring them being good. But I think you're going to see a lot more of an understanding of what kind of a coach he can be without having his 2-star players there. So really fascinated by this game. You get it at Rice Cycle Stadium, so you should be able to have an advantage, but we've seen that this can be crazy no matter what. Depending on how that BYU game went the week before, there could be another hangover. There could be, where you kind of get loose, where let's say Utah goes to Provo and wins, regardless of the score. You may be coming on a high and you kind of take things easy against Colorado and kind of loosen up. It's really easy to kind of see some of those things happen. So really curious to see this 2-game stretch. I don't think it's the most pivotal stretch of the season by any means based on how things have gone. But like I mentioned, if Utah is 4-2 going into this 2-game stretch and you leave it 4-4, you're in a world of hurt, right? You've got to at least split these 2 games to be able to be competitive. Even then, splitting these 2 games, especially if you lost to Texas Tech and Arizona State, you're not really going to be factoring into the Big 12 title race. You're going to be potentially improved on the year, but it's not going to be as good as you would hope. So as much as I say this isn't a pivotal stretch, it's at least a good point of the season where you're going to understand kind of what this team is made of, right? If they've had early success, and let's say they're 4-2 or even 5-1 for that matter, can they sustain that through a tough rivalry game against BYU and then following it up the week after against Colorado at home? That's where you get to learn the mettle of this team, see how they are, see how they're fighting, that kind of stuff. So really curious to see these 2 games being played. I think they're exciting. Especially that BYU game going down to Provo is always an entertaining game just because of how those fans pack that stadium. They get loud. Utah's biggest situation there is really you have to take the crowd out of it. And if you can take the crowd out of it, you're going to help your situation. But outside of that, it's going to be a tall task. So we'll come back next week where we're going to talk about Cincinnati and Baylor. 2 interesting games. Cincinnati's a team on the rise-ish, we think. And then Baylor absolutely is a team where we talked about this, where this is a team that Utah played early on in the season as a non-conference game based on prior schedules. And it looked like Utah was going to roll, right? They end up winning the game close, but they looked like they were going to roll because Cam Rising was dominating. And then suddenly that was the infamous Cooler incident that ended Cam Rising's career, and everything went south for Utah. On the opposite end, Baylor, they still had some struggles for the next couple weeks and then finally put it together and went on a heater. And suddenly it's being talked about as one of the best teams in the conference. If you believe Phil Steele's predictions, he believes that Baylor's the best team in the conference coming in. So really fascinated by these 2 games. And we'll see how that goes. So with that, we'll sign off today, and we will get back to you again next week talking more games. We'll recap the official visits that are wrapping up for Utah and kind of where Utah stands, and then we're getting closer to Big 12 Media Days. After that Cincinnati Baylor game or week, and then Kansas State Kansas week, we get Big 12 Media Days. So we're getting closer. Hope you're having a fun summer. Hopefully you're not getting sunburned, but you're out doing something fun and you're not stuck in an office working. With that said, we'll chat you later. Adios.